Claire Maslen, Chief Marketing Officer at Consult Hyperion, will moderate and present a panel on the identity of people. She'll introduce you to all her amazing panel members.
Gents, you can remove your masks whilst they get tangled up in our headsets. So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this session as we continue some of the thoughts that Dave and Matt were exploring around identity of people. I have a fantastic lineup this afternoon, and these people are actually doing stuff. So I would like you all to spend, a minute or so giving your introductions, talking about who you are, what your business does, and where you see things going, and then we'll do a recap of that after we've had the discussion. So, Andrew, let's start with yourself.
Thank you, Claire. I'm Andrew Budd. I'm the founder and CEO of London-based iProov. We assure the genuine presence of people. So we authenticate remote users online, whether they're on any device, whether they're on a smartphone or laptop, and we authenticate them against a trusted image. So in the world of digital identity, we are the last mile. We are what links a digital entity, a digital representation of a person, to the real physical human being, and we do so in such a way as to present spoofs of all sorts, whether those are artifacts, like masks or photographs or videos on iPads, or digital injection attacks using recordings replayed or deepfakes. And we do this for governments around the world, including Singapore and Australia and certain states in the United States. And we do this for financial institutions around the world, and we do this for a growing number of digital identity providers.
Thank you. Irra.
Hi, my name is Irra Ariela Kai. I'm CEO of Zamna Technologies. And at Zamna, before COVID, we had one job, which is to enable travelers to say, oh, where's my passport? I'm ready to fly. And we would validate that identity document, your passport. Pre-COVID, for British Airways alone, we were doing this 100,000 times every day. Post-COVID, it was 100 times a day. Travel really crashed last April. And now, of course, that's only half of what we need to validate for a traveler's identity. Passport is no longer enough. We also have to have a health document to go with it, and indeed to match that identity. So that's the next stage of what Zamna does, and I'm here to tell you a little bit more about that as we develop our discussion. We work with health providers now, we work with airlines. Governments are beneficiaries of what we do, but we don't yet work directly with governments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Irra. Edgar.
Hi, I'm Edgar Whitley. I'm an academic, so I don't have a business in that sense other than educating students, some of whom are actually in the room. I've been studying digital identity for at least 15 years. I'm currently co-chair of the Privacy and Consumer Advisory Group to the Government Digital Service, and also a member of their Privacy and Inclusion Advisory Forum. Also involved in the National Data Strategy Forum, and was also an observer for the document checking service pilot that the Minister just mentioned.
Thank you. And John.
Hi there, John Abbott. I'm the Chief Business Officer at Yoti. Yoti's a global technology business based out of the UK. We cover a range of identity-based solutions, from a consumer-based reusable digital ID, so putting the control in the hands of the consumer, and then equally across a range of B2B services that covers identity verification, age verification, electronic signatures, and digital signing, through to authentication and verification, sort of anti-spoofing. We work with governments, so one of our first clients was the government of Jersey, reusing that citizen ID. We work with the Improvement Service in Scotland, and a whole bunch of others. And that does span all industries, really, from what we would hope to checking your age in the supermarket through to verifying yourself for regulated services.
Okay, so I'm going to start with a big question, first of all. Why has this been so hard, and why is it taking so long? Because, you all talk of experiences that have gone on for a number of years. Andrew, you're laughing, presumably about our age and being involved in this still. But why has it been so difficult? And actually, when Matt spoke of a framework, is a framework the thing that is going to get this moving? Who would like to start? Andrew?
Well, I laugh because when I founded iProov about 9 years ago, I was fired up by the imminence of digital identity because it was such an obvious thing that the world needed to do. Look, one of the challenges is digital identity is a two-sided market. And creating two-sided markets is inherently very difficult and expensive. Secondly, there's no business model for it. And therefore, it's a two-sided market with no business model. What could go wrong?
Irra?
I completely agree. The chicken and the egg situation of what's good enough for us as individuals to provide and what is trustworthy enough for organizations to accept is something that no one has solved yet to date. And the reason I think it's taken so long is because there are no wrong answers until somebody decides that something is better than another method. I believe that everyone on this panel is in the Wild West of identity as it stands today. And I believe also that is a good thing, because if we wait for frameworks or legislation to come first, it'll be 2045 and we'll still be presenting bits of paper that somebody needs to scan somewhere or pay somebody to physically or manually look at. And ultimately, in terms of digitizing an identity process, we heard the minister talk about Estonia and best practices from other governments. Estonia is the size of Croydon. It's all right for one small country to be able to do it. But in terms of a national solution, let alone an international one, I think the more opportunities we have to do it without creating difficulties or frictions for the end user, for us as individuals. And the more we put the onus onto the organizations, the corporations who have the budget and the resources to do something about it, the faster we'll get there, because you'll get there at scale. Otherwise, the friction will just kill it. It's just like 1997 when identity cards were pretty much dead in the water in the UK government. No one wanted to use them, and as Andrew said, that side of the marketplace didn't even get started.
Edgar, societally, have we moved on? Are we more open to the idea of identity?
Yeah, I think absolutely we are. And I think Irra made a really interesting point about focusing on the end user, because that then pushes against some really interesting tensions commercially around standards and around competition. So if you are a large player who can do good identity proving, and the obvious one at the moment is the NHS health app, not the check-in app, the health app, that does do identity proofing, does it for everybody in England, so not the whole UK, but with a bit of interoperability, but also has that tied to your NHS number, which isn't intended to be used as an identifier across all different sectors. So you've suddenly got a large player that potentially dominates the market, and then you want to also have competition, and you'd like to have standards, and everybody else would like their standards to be the standards that are going to push things forward. So I can see how it's been so hard. You can see ways forward, but not necessarily ways forward that everyone will say, yep, that's definitely going to be the solution.
John, you've got a consumer brand. So from the uptake in your products and services, are people ready to adopt a digital identity?
Yeah, I think they have been for some time. I think depends on the use case and the utility. So I think we've been founded since 2014, and currently we stand at about 2.5 million installs in the UK, about 10 million globally. So that shows in itself there's an appetite to do that.
It might be worth actually explaining a little bit more about Yoti from a consumer's experience.
Sure. Yeah, so if you were one of our, say, UK use cases for 17 turning 18-year-olds is with Child Trust Fund One Family. So they might say, if you want to prove your age and identity, go and download a free Yoti app. So I download that onto my phone, I identify myself with my mobile number, some biometric authentication into my what would be then secure wallet, and I add in my identity documents. So key thing there is trust, that I'm not sure that who are Yoti, can I trust Yoti, what do I do, what's Yoti going to do with my data? So I think that's a really important thing to make sure that trust, that just sort of unwritten trust contract is there to make sure that they're very aware and clear about where their data goes. We don't see any of the data, we don't access in it, we can't sell it. Even if we tried to, we couldn't access it. And we allow that person to create a very secure personal wallet and then securely share elements of that with, in this case, one family. That could be on a Monday, one family, on a Tuesday, a supermarket, on a Wednesday, a government, and so forth. We believe that that's the future, therefore, of reusable ID is I don't want 5 companies with 5 copies of my passport. Really, I want to keep that details to myself and just share the data minimized bare elements with that company. And it then becomes a win-win. They store less data. Even if we do say it's secure, there's plenty of data breaches and hacks currently. So that sort of model, I think, people do buy into from a consumer base. They really want to see further endpoints and utilities to use it. And I support all comments here that a framework and a government position will absolutely help. But this is already happening today under interoperable emerging frameworks that would allow wallet A to share with wallet B and so forth. So I think that is a bare fact. It is happening. I think we should be leading far more than we are, I think, in the UK to do that globally.
Can I make the point, Claire? This conversation is a very, very UK-centric conversation. In other countries, this problem is now more or less solved. If we look in Scandinavia, Bank ID. If you look in Italy, you have SPID. If you look in Singapore, you have SingPass, where digital ID is already a done deal and a mass phenomenon. I think it's important to note we're talking here very much about the UK, which is a bit of a special case, has its own specific troubles and tribulations, and where this trust framework actually may very well prove to be the next step towards the future that may prove useful in other territories as well. Okay,
so obviously we've mentioned a couple of use cases as we've gone along. Age verification, John, you spoke about that. For me, personal hobby horse is we talk a lot about identity being able to permit access to services. For me, age verification is very much about preventing access to certain services. We can do that physically currently. We expect children to show proof of, or young people to show proof of age to buy alcohol and cigarettes. Online, it's still a problem. So what are the next steps on this? How are we going to address age verification online? Who would like to take that one?
I'm sorry, you guys are the experts.
I think if you rewind in the history of the UK, recent legislation was pushed back in this regard, so that certainly hampers those abilities to get that more prevalent online. We already do that online. We work with social media companies through to even the NSPCC in different use cases, either sometimes proving you're over an age, sometimes proving you're under an age. And that can be done anonymously, digitally, and remotely. So it does absolutely exist today. And I think very topical things at the moment around petitions for proving in social media and over age and identity and accounts. That technology absolutely exists at a scalable fashion internationally. I think Andrew made a good point in terms of the UK as a special case where we have a somewhat love-hate relationship with identity and identity cards and the history of that and centralized databases and so forth. And I think a really important point is to make sure that you can verify someone or check their age in a very secure way and distribute that so that they control their data. And that receiving party, whether it's a gambling site, whether it's a supermarket, whether it's a government service, only receives that sort of facet. I think we can definitely do that today.
I think age verification is one of the interesting use cases that can drive the take-up of verifiable credentials, because it's a compelling reason to use zero-knowledge proofs, which are one of the great assets of the modern generation verifiable credentials. And when people are sort of saying, what are verifiable credentials for? When you're trying to prove your age and nothing else at all.
I was just going to say, let's take it back a step and actually talk about what are zero knowledge proofs, what are verifiable credentials, just in case we have any gaps in our knowledge on this point.
So let me see if I can summarize that quickly, unless anybody else. Verifiable credentials is the concept that you as a citizen have a private repository, some people call it a wallet, but it's basically your own private filing cabinet full of facts about you, which have been signed and certified by whoever created those facts. And when you're asked things about those facts, instead of just handing them out, what you can do is you can mathematically answer a question. So if you may have within your filing cabinet a birth certificate, but using verifiable credential technology, someone can ask, are you over 18? And you can mathematically prove that the documents in your filing cabinet show that you are over 18. So you can answer the question, if that's what a zero knowledge proof means. You can answer a question without disclosing any other information about you. And the great thing about verifiable credentials is that you can kind of build up. It blurs the gap between what we conventionally know as digital identity, name, address, date of birth, and all the other things that are useful to be able to assert about oneself. You keep them all in a place, they can be maintained, and then you can hand out the information in exactly the quantities that you need to, but in a way that is completely privacy respecting and completely secure. So there are many good qualities about it, and one of the nice things about the UK trust framework that is being developed now is that it has been written deliberately to straddle the previous world of digital identity as this kind of filing cabinet out of which you have to hand facts, and the new world in the framework, it just talks about attributes of verifiable credentials, which have the great advantage now of being completely covered by a comprehensive set of international W3C standards.
Okay, Irra.
We're definitely getting there, aren't we? And Andrew, like you, I get fired up about the subject because to me, it's a data question as opposed to just a attributes question. So when Andrew describes these filing cabinets, a lot of the onus is on us as individuals to make sure today in the modern world, I have my digital cabinet, I have my wallet, I have a £1,000 mobile device in my hand. I'm privileged, I have one. But when we think of children, I have 4, parents, mine are over 70, people who really want to access the same services with the same opportunities, but maybe they haven't got the technological ability to participate in that process. What then? So when we sought to answer this problem, not just in the UK context, but by default with our clients whose business it is to create opportunities for international travel, for airlines, they were always very keen to make sure that even if you are in the middle of India, in a pay-per-minute internet cafe, you do not have to do anything else that you perhaps are already used to doing. And that layer of security in being able to assert data sets and prove them, that's the two-sided chicken and egg problem that we at Zamna have to help our clients solve. Because Andrew, myself, or Claire can provide data all we want, authorizing it at the source of truth or checking that it's been previously validating somewhere before. Today, it's impossible. So everyone might have seen yesterday there was a huge piece of, I think, 7-hour queues in Heathrow because staff are 1, quarantining themselves, 2, have to manually read documents, compare the names. Some of these documents are in a different language. It is hell on earth traveling. I downloaded 5 apps to go between London and Madrid 2 weeks ago. Today is day 1 post-quarantine, thank goodness. But that is not the way that we bring scale back into this. That is not the way that we solve digital identity by saying, if you cannot access this app, you cannot participate in the digital economy. That can't be the answer for everyone. I'm glad that I have that, but if you don't, what then? So with Zamna, what we've started to do is to look at ourselves as a data layer. And when we heard about different challenges that were being experienced by passengers, up until now, I think we've done this about 47 million times for passport validations, and importantly, without seeing any of that data. And we don't exist. We want to be the most successful company you've never heard of. We don't exist for the end passenger. They don't care who's validating this data because we're not forcing them to do anything else. So our approach has been to partner with people whose job it is to be in front of the customer. If you're providing an app, the customer should be owned by you. We can sit underneath that and support that with very robust proprietary data processes to make sure it's secure and accurate at source as well. That data at source is actually something really interesting that I think we should consider in what you guys are doing. For example, you do that with the biometric data at source, biographic data at source. I think that hasn't been solved yet as well. There's too much fraud still going on.
Yes, because ultimately if we create all these digital identities and someone hacks them, someone steals them, unless they are tied to an individual biometrically, then actually you're just giving someone free rein.
Forgive me for speaking again, but I think that is absolutely the core to this, that there's a lot of conversation about digital identities, which are really just dossiers of facts about you, but these things are floating free and potentially dangerous until you can tie them to a real, live, physical human being, because in the end, trust relies in real flesh and blood, people who take responsibility, and it's that, and actually that process of authentication, of asserting your unequivocal right to assert the facts in your digital identity, that is the critical moment, it's the critical breakage point, it's the critical point of attack, but it's also got to be very easy and accessible. It's unacceptable that the only way that you can assert a digital identity is to have a smartphone. If, like my son did a little while ago, you drop it in the toilet, it's not okay that you've lost your digital identity. And ultimately, these things are all proxies. In the end, the digital identity belongs to flesh and blood, and that's why biometrics are so vital, and that's why cloud-based biometrics are so important, because if your identity resides in the cloud, then the way that you assert that identity must reside in the cloud as well, and it must be protected in the cloud. And that's actually one of the great reasons, if you're talking about accessibility, and it's not acceptable for people to have a smartphone in order to assert their identity, that says that the authentication mechanism must not depend solely upon a smartphone. And the issue of authentication is not often talked about in the context of digital identity, whereas in fact it's the pivot around which it revolves.
Can I just add to that as well? So I mean, on the premise of having an app-based solution that grows in that regard, there are clearly a number of people, and pretty much everyone in this room is going to have, I guarantee, a smartphone in their pocket and linked to that. We took two routes, and I think when we talk about inclusivity, is to talk about both the possession of a smartphone or not having a smartphone, possession of a document and not having a document. There's a vast percentage of people in the UK, unsurprisingly, don't have any documents, and as younger people grow up, they're not getting driver's licenses as quickly as they might, and therefore you fall back into taking your physical passport. Less so in the last 18 months, but hopefully as we open up, that will unfortunately again be a case. So I think we partnered very recently with the Post Office. That will be a growing partnership where not only are you able to benefit where you've got an app and you can do a fully remote journey, but if I'm an individual that needs assistance, needs a in-person discussion when I do that, that's where that postmaster route can come in, where you've got someone within 3 miles and you can go in to then start to verify your documents with a in-person part of the journey and then return that to a digital sense. So you might start on an iPad, have a conversation and get assistance with your document checks or so forth, depending on your different types of docs, and then return back to that sort of digital path. And I think a key thing out of that is the inclusivity aspect. So I totally agree. We are 100% backing in the smartphone app basis, but very much agree with what Irra said. That's got to work on smaller phones. It's got to work on international levels, places with poorer data downloads or expensive data downloads, high cost of mobile contract switching. All of those come into play if you can create a very interoperable global solution, which is really tough to do. And that's why it's probably answering the first question. It hasn't been done well anywhere internationally. Maybe in financial services within areas start to do a pilot. You've got it within airlines are looking at their space. You've got the ICO for looking at the age verification aspects. None of those really join together. And the only thing that does join it together is that individual, either with that document or without a document, or with a phone or without a phone.
Mm-hmm. Irra, did you have a comment?
Yeah, and just, sorry, in my experience of the international use case, if we want to talk about that, Andrew's very right in that the warm body of a human being travelling has to identify themselves. But when you put the onus on the end passengers to do this, you are inviting chaos. What we have seen happen in practice, again, and this is where the industry is going, if you can solve this using data that you have previously seen before, because chances are this passenger has not traveled once, they have at least taken a return journey to come home if they've left their country and their home, then you can actually build up almost like a trust reputational score in a data set, whether it is only a biographic reputational data score of data held in your passport, or indeed a biometric one as well, if the facilities are there. And what's really interesting in thinking about digital identity is how we can now use technology to create persistence. You do not have to have a one-off verification. You don't have to identify yourself and then get treated like, for example, you've never flown before. Why do airlines put us through passport checks time and time again? Because they can't persist that data. Why do we have to provide our identity documents today or my health document? Because they can't trust that data set. And trust inherently only comes if you have some sort of ability to check what I'm claiming as my data, as a traveler or as a person accessing a service, against a source of truth. If you cannot connect to a source of truth, then your identity check is redundant, or any data check is redundant. And that's what we're trying to help our clients solve, because ultimately, in passport context, a government and an airline need to work together, but they can't. They can't send my passport data set to 20 airlines so that I don't have to keep providing it. Any health provider that I used in Spain on the way home to London can't take my test and send it onto the airline. They should be able to, but they can't, because privacy and data security. So working a layer below that and trying to match those documents using some of the approaches we've been discussing, zero knowledge proofs, the technological reality that exists today in being able to match data in a super secure way. That's how we open this up at scale, and that's how we take the onus away from the end individual or the traveler or the person accessing a service and put that onus onto the big organization who's trying to remove friction for all of us in the first place.
Okay, Edgar.
So it was just some reflections on this underlying source of truth. And of course, many young people won't have a passport. Mm-hmm. And that's where the digitization of other government records becomes really important. So we have digital birth records, but pre-2009, I think, that basically means it's on a microfiche. Mm-hmm. So it's electronic-ish, but it's not actually that searchable. And so we have a real big challenge. So it's great having these attributes that we can stick into a wallet and then have verifiable credentials, but you still need to have that link back to the original physical carbon-based life form that you then make those connections to. And so I think we have to be, and of course, international travel, we already have the passport, which is a proxy for something about you that a trusted agency, namely in the UK, the Passport Office, have done the checks about. That's all it is. It's a government-issued proof that this credential links to this physical person. So we have to, I think there's an unsolvable problem about that source of truth. Estonia is small. It also has the benefit that it has a civil registry that it just uses and says, if you're on the civil registry, you're absolutely fine. We will trust everything from that arguably single data point, which, if you're comfortable with that, is great. But if you're worried about fraud, could very easily become a huge area of concern.
But you're also creating a single point of failure.
Yeah.
Claire and I were talking earlier, a government database is critical national infrastructure. Yeah. I mean, if Andrew and I had a bit of spare time, we'd team up and force a nefarious action on something. We'd go after really tasty data sets.
I think we have to remember that pretty much everywhere, most countries in the world outside the UK and the United States have centralized anagraphic records. I mean, to tell any European resident that their anagraphic details are not stored in a commune, in a municipality, in a commune, and nowadays are not becoming digitized, they'll look at you like you're mad. So we in the UK are very much the exception. Most places, certainly everywhere that I know of in Europe, has these centralized records of births, marriages, and deaths, which are now increasingly digitally accessible. And I think it's actually a huge handicap in the United Kingdom that we don't have it. Having lived in Europe, it's not entirely clear to me what the benefit of not having it has been, but that's just historical, and people can have lots of different opinions about that. I'm not aware of the anagraphic records in any major territory having been hacked, and I'm not sure even what you'd get from it. Why bother to hack it when you can just read the electoral register?
It's typically more the claims. So I visited the Civil Registry in Santiago, Chile, and we went to the legal department, and there was a box of files just labeled bigamy. Because those are, if your rights to property are based on being the child of the marriage, there are those kinds of practical, that in practice need investigation, because you may have 2 marriage certificates because nobody actually did the check that you've cancelled the first one before you get the second one. So there are some practice, so it's not necessarily a hack, but if you can get that record put in, then you can start to do all sorts of other fun things.
But isn't it an embarrassment if as a national government body you get hacked?
Yeah.
Isn't that just truly unwanted by any government out there that's even remotely digitally thinking?
I mean, I spent nearly 10 years living in Italy, and in Italy the databases are entirely distributed. So your records, your anagraphic records, are held by each separate comune, which obviously adds a good deal of security to it. But it actually has, I think, enabled the Italians to roll out the SPID, the huge national digital identity scheme, which has exploded during COVID and is, I think, one of the great global success stories, very readily.
I think when we founded Yoti, the premise of that very early on was the design of that database that you sit there. And there will be lots of talks around, is it fully self-sovereign and fully decentralized, where you have the actual information in the handset or in another data store or in a cloud that you only access yourself. We take a hybrid model where we do have the control and the enterprise security of having that sort of in physical UK-based infrastructure that you can audit and get certificates for, and all the other things that you might trust from a government or any other national infrastructure type route. But then decentralize that for the customer data. So there is no centrally accessible profile or anything else. That means that if you did ever were, from your point, ever hacked in that, you'd be going through layers of infrastructure and security and encryption, and you might end up with a date of birth. You have to try again, you'll end up with a name. You will never know if those two are actually related. So very quickly, the economics of trying to make that a viable hack sort of goes out the window. It becomes very challenging to do. But that comes with consequences. You have to trust the organization doing that to make sure that they are not going to lie about what they're doing. We do a lot in our sort of, again, consumer trust base as a consumer brand from our guardian councils and people that can, rat us out if we decide we're going to change our mind and try and access the data. Then our reputation is toast very quickly. So I think that's really important in the models of those businesses. Either operating on the data layer where it's kind of invisible. If you're in the bridging that gap between a consumer and a business, that's a really hard model to do. And most models to date have been based out of harvesting data as a commercial model. That can't exist with the realms of identity.
But also, I mean, this discussion is the concern in the public is sometimes very unbalanced. People worry a lot about hacking digital identity databases, and therefore we shouldn't expose it. The result is that millions of people have their identities hacked all the time. The number of identity thefts in the United States doubled last year. So while we're busily worrying about what might happen if we put in place the digital infrastructure to protect people's identities are being compromised all the time, causing immense pain and suffering. If anyone's had their identity stolen, if anyone's had bank accounts set up, loans taken out in their name, they will know that what they have done is traded off a theoretical risk of some digital identity hack for a real and present danger. And I think there needs to be more discussion about the balance of risks. For people who've never had their identity hacked, it's very easy to argue. It's very easy to argue that measures put in place to prevent it happening worry them. This is not a zero-sum game.
But I think from a consumer's perspective, from the mass media, I think these arguments and these conversations aren't translated into simple scenarios. So, I mean, you summed it up there. You know, people are worrying and fretting about a potential government hack or a Big Brother attack, something bad, when actually they're putting their data all over social media and paying for stuff left, right and centre through insecure sites.
We get asked all the time, oh, but, you know, so you're processing face. What happens if my face gets hacked? People ask me this. What happens if they break into your database and steal my face? You know, hands up those who haven't spewed their faces all over the internet in social media. Hands up those who wear a medieval helmet every time they come out of their house in case someone is standing in front of their house to photograph them when they come out. It is completely irrational, and yet these narratives build up and become real obstacles to progress in some case. And one just has to patiently chip away at them with logical reasoning, and then people get the idea.
Irra is itching to speak.
Only because as a provider versus an individual, I see different risk models. The risk model for me as an individual, the risk to me as an individual is actually quite low. In the post kind of GDPR world, it's even lower. There are checks and balances, there is safety. In this political environment, there are. I was born in a really dysfunctional country, formerly known as the USSR. I traveled to really dysfunctional countries as part of my work. In Russia, there are over 200 types of acceptable passports. The organizations checking them, and actually the organizations producing them, are not exactly going to have the same honor code as somewhere different around the world. So ultimately, for an organization that operates beyond the borders of an honorable political environment, such as an international airline that has to travel and fly passengers all over the place, regardless of the politics there, any organizations that is involved in border checks, any organization where business is international, does carry a hell of a lot more risk in terms of the profile of that data being secured. As an individual, I'm not so worried about wearing a helmet. As an organization, I'd be a hell of a lot more worried to have the right protections in place, to have those helmet-like things that stop me from being on the chopping block for being a really bad actor and not having the best practices, the most secure data. And quite frankly, if I can, and with Zamna, this is what we're making possible, don't keep any sensitive data at all. We enable our clients to recognize data if they've seen it before without having to store a copy of that data and to protect a copy of that sensitive data. So I'd like to just separate the dialogue here into two strands. One is corporate and the other is personal, and they have very different profiles depending on where you're operating.
Yeah, John.
I just said, agree with that. I think I just have one extra point where I think on the adoption scale, back to kind of right where the beginning, how do you get this at a national level of rollout? I do my tax return once a year. By that point, currently I've forgotten the password to get back in the following year. How often might I go on a flight, or might I come to a conference? How often do I go to the supermarket? How often do I do everyday lifestyle things? And I think that as part of that trust base is getting it normalized, that it doesn't have to be these big events in your life. It can, people don't realize that their identity is being used in many, many different ways, even down to a simple loyalty card and what you might track from that. So, I think on a government side, I think the initiative they've finally started doing now is the Home Office sandbox on age for alcohol purchase. Pick a big supermarket is putting 15 to 20 million people in terms of transactions a week. And a large percentage of those, between 15 and 20%, are doing age verification, usually for some form that requires some form of presentation of ID. So how do you accelerate those other industries where you do have more valuable transactional stuff at stake from going abroad or accessing government services? You can actually accelerate that from everyday use cases that are almost totally below the radar on the sort of aficionados digital ID kind of point of view, but are really, really important to getting that sort of mainstay of adoption. I think that's really important for the UK to lead on that.
On use cases, should we talk about health?
I was just going to say, so we've got 120 seconds left. So very quickly, let's talk about health, because going into the pandemic, identity was about getting people on board, being able to access different services. Coming out or into waiting for another pandemic, Dave, there is this issue of travel and health. So very quickly.
With what we've been discussing before the session, Claire, I mean, we believe you can't solve health without solving identity. We've seen how COVID spread because airlines and border forces could not identify the physical body, which is now a biological weapon carrying COVID across international borders. And so with our work with health, we've been trying to create an approach which, again, doesn't require hard surgery or installations or in-person checks. All of this can be pre-checked before a passenger comes to the airport. And ultimately, health as a credential, as a status, needs to be verified whether you have a vaccine or not. Because if you've had a vaccine and you're sick at a point in time when you enter a plane, which is essentially an aluminium tube with 300 others, that is too late down the road to identify that particular status of your identity. Therefore, we're seeing a lot of our clients asking us to bring that process a hell of a lot further upstream. So you have to have both the biographical, the written data set, you know, have you got a document, have you got a health certificate, and the biometric, which I'm sure Andrew, you'll comment on in a minute, with identity providers like iProov saying, look, all of those data sets are connected to that warm physical body, and we can approve or validate them, which is what Zamna does, before you even leave your house, let alone when you're queuing perhaps in an airport context. So solving health and identity has to go hand in hand. You can't do one without the other.
So one of our clients said the critical thing, the most critical resource at a point of check, whether it's at a border or on an aeroplane or when you go into a venue like a nightclub, the two critical resources are time and space. So all the checks that are going to have to be taken, health checks and so on, have got to be moved away from that point. So exactly as you say, the idea is you do these checks, you do the binds beforehand, and there is this critical issue that vaccine certificates and vaccine status are all identified by name and date of birth. At some point, you've got to bind that to a physical human being, which always comes down to a face. That's always what gets checked at the venue. So our argument is, if you don't do that beforehand and then provide an extremely fast way to just check the face and therefore the eligibility to enter, it'll be too slow, it'll take up too much time, it'll take too much space, and in practice, people will simply bypass it. The checkers won't check, the people will get forgeries, and what we'll end up with is COVID theatre. We'll end up with expensive schemes that waste a lot of time and a lot of money and cause a lot of hassle and accomplish absolutely nothing. So only if we can move the health checking back from the point of entry and then provide a quick mechanism for the carbon-based life form to authenticate their ownership of that pre-checked identity so that they can go through immediately and securely and unforgeably. To my view, that is the only way that health checks are actually going to work in practice, whether they're on boarding aeroplanes, whether they're at borders, or whether when you're going into a nightclub or into a conference venue. So with that, we are absolutely out of time. Thank you so much. It's been a really passionate and engaging discussion. Thank you to all of the panelists, and I'll hand back over now. Thank you.